All right, well, I'll start so welcome to Bible study. Today is, what's today?
28th.
28th, September 28th. We're going to be in the book of Exodus. We've left Genesis, and as like Elvis, we have exited the building, so we'll be talking about that. So as we start this week, we're going to start with our typical signs. So the first one, the golden rule will never tarnish. The golden rule will never tarnish. This one I really liked. Don't let people drive you crazy when it's within walking distance. Yes. So speaking of that, though, I was coming back from Trigo yesterday, and I'm in Clayton, and this guy zings out in front of me. He's got a boat behind him. I'm like, there's nobody behind me. Just pulls right out in front of me. I slam on my brakes, and his boat almost falls over. I'm like, dude, it would have been 2 more minutes. I would have been past you. You wouldn't have to. I was like, holy cow. I'm like, I don't understand why people are so in a hurry. So that was fun. So I'm glad it didn't tip over, though. I was like, man. The trees are about to show us how lovely it is to let things go.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. When God is glorified, Satan is horrified. I think that should have been more so closer to Halloween, but clothe yourself in goodness, prevent wardrobe malfunctions. And this is yesterday's. Yesterday's was pretty good too. The best you can do for this world is to make the most of yourself. The best you can do for this world is to make the most of yourself. So, which is all good. So I'm actually going to do something a little different today too before we jump right in. And basically I just want to go around the table and see how you're doing. If you want to say something, great. If not, you say pass. So just to see how everybody's doing, just check in to see what's going on, because I don't learn a lot of things until I hear it from you guys. So if you want to say something, great. If not, you can just say pass. So, well, I'll tell you one funny story from this weekend. So I get there on Sunday night, and the gal gives me 4 key cards for the room. And so what I do is I stay. So there's like a main lodge that you stay at, or there's these other outbuildings, and I stay at one of the outbuildings. It's cheaper. It's about a half-mile walk in. I like the exercise, and so. I went over there, tried my keys. None of them worked. 4 keys. None of them worked. So I drove back. Oh, yeah, we'll give you another set of keys. All right. I got in. So then later that night, I walked back about 9 or 10 o'clock at night because I had a flashlight with me, and I just wanted to see the stars. I get back to my place. None of the key cards work. So I have to drive back over there again because I have my car there at least. So I drove back over there, and she gave me another 4. So the next day, I went for a walk. Went back. None of the key cards worked again. Drove back over there again. I was like, so it took 16 key cards for me to get one that worked more than once.
Are all of these little places identical?
They are, but everybody was having problems, though. That was the one thing is they need to get a new machine, because it wasn't just us. It was, because the guy I was with, too, they only gave him 1, but he had to keep going back 2. I mean, so.
But then maybe you kept trying the wrong.
I don't know. I kept looking. I'm like, is this the right duplex? Yep, that's the right one. And they said, go really slow. So I'm like, I'm going really, really slow. And, yeah, it was fun. So. Yeah, but, it still was nice. It still was nice. Nice walks and stuff like that. So. Speaking of walks, that brings a good segue to Exodus this week. So we are out of the book of Genesis. So where is Exodus in the Bible? Next to Genesis. So we are in the second. Yeah, next one. We don't even go that far. So, so the interesting thing about again, if we look at our text from Exodus. So just look at the first verse from the first chapter in Exodus. And so again, if you remember the way that Hebrews did their book, what's the first sort of phrase in Exodus chapter 1, verse 1?
These are the names of.
These are the names of. So the Hebrew word is basically names. So the interesting part, you're probably wondering, well, where do we get the Greek word, or where do we get the word Exodus from? Well, it's actually from the ancient Greek, and it's Romanized to Exodos. Exodos is the Romanized version of that. And so what do you guys remember about Exodus? What is some stuff that you know about Exodus?
Well, Joseph died, so it's a new
Yep.
era.
Yep.
That's
So just
very true.
yeah, so that's a good reminder. So we got last week we did the story of Joseph. So Joseph gets out of prison. The king loves what he does, and he interprets his dreams. And so the king the Pharaoh, I should say, puts Joseph in charge. He's the second in command of all of Egypt, and they have 7 good years of crops and stuff. So he stores them all away. And so when they have 7 years of famine, he's able to give people food, and the Egyptians were able to, in some sense, corner the market and able to give people stuff. And so Joseph he finds his family comes there, and he invites his family to end up staying in Egypt. And there is some reconciliation between him and his brothers because, like I said, there's a lot of family dynamics in that particular family. Yeah, it was interesting how that sort of all turned out, but at the end of the day, he forgave his brothers.
Did he have any sisters?
I think so. If I remember right,
Yes.
yes, he did.
Diana.
Yes.
Isn't that Joseph's sister?
I believe he's had some sisters as well. So I know he had 12 brothers,
Yeah.
or 11 brothers.
Yeah.
So there's 12 of them. But yeah, so yes, I definitely bet there was some girls and all that. So yes. So the whole family came together, and they all settled in the land of Egypt. And this is where they stayed, and their family grew, and more and more people. And so we get to a point where now the Pharaoh doesn't remember, the new Pharaoh in charge doesn't remember anything about Joseph. And he's like, I don't know if he necessarily didn't remember or didn't care to remember. Maybe is probably the better way to look at it. He's like, no, he's like, these Hebrews are a problem. They're a blight on the country. They take all the best land. They steal our food. They are not, they're not productive citizens.
In verse 8 of chapter 1, it says, "Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing
Yep.
came to power in Egypt."
Absolutely.
And that's the story.
And that's the story. And so we're now at this point where the people are enslaved, and they get to do all the backbreaking work. They get to make whatever sort of projects the Egyptians want them to make, and they're not treated well. And the new king, or the new Pharaoh, is very much tries to find as many ways to make life difficult for the Hebrews as possible. And so out of that comes what biblical person? Who's a
Holy Moses.
Holy Moses. Holy Moses comes out. Probably one of the most important people in the whole Bible. Moses is probably one of those most important characters in the Bible. And some would argue Exodus is one of the most important books of the Bible, even more than the Gospels, which I thought was interesting. Some people would make that because a lot of what happens in Exodus, there's a lot of metaphorical, spiritual. There's a lot of things that we take out of Exodus that translates into other books of the Bible, because we really see who the character of God is. We understand that God honors God's promises. We see how God works with the people. We see why Jesus needs to be here. We see how Jesus is often compared to the new Moses. There's a lot of it's not an accident when Jesus is transformed or transfigured on the mountain, that the people that come see him, one of the people is Moses. Moses is really huge in the Jewish culture. People know Moses. If you have somebody who's Jewish, you ask them about Moses, they'll have a lot to tell you about that. So Moses is raised up. Moses is actually. Does anybody know the beginning of Moses? What's the story of Moses? Do you guys remember what the story?
I can't speak. I can't do it.
Well, there's that. Yes.
That was the
Yes.
baby in the basket.
Yeah, baby in the basket. Baby in the basket. So
Burning bush.
burning bush. So yeah, there's a lot of these familiar stories that you're used to, and so Moses is raised as an Egyptian, as part of Egyptian royalty. He ends up killing an Egyptian because the Egyptian was threatening some Hebrews. He hides the body, and the next day these two Hebrews have an argument, and they say, "What, you're going to kill us the same way you did the Egyptian?" And so he flees, and he goes off far into the wilderness. And then God calls him back through the burning bush. And then, like Louise was saying, God says, "You're going to speak for me." And Moses is like, I ain't doing that. You crazy? I can't even talk right. So Moses had a stutter. And so he was adamant he's not going to go speak. And then his brother Aaron's, and then God said, "Well, let's bring your brother Aaron along. He'll do all the speaking for you." And Moses is like, "Well," and God's like, "Enough. You're going." Fine. So they go back. And so then you have these times when Moses and Aaron are talking to the Pharaoh. And what happens during that time? What happens when Moses and Aaron are talking to the Pharaoh? What sort of begins to happen? It's one of the big events.
You mean the plagues?
The plagues happen. So you see, in some sense, so as a reminder, who was Pharaoh in the eyes of the Egyptian people?
God.
He was God.
Pure God.
Yep. So in some sense, you have the Egyptian God versus the Hebrew God, and so the plagues really show who is dominant. And so God comes through at the end and says, "This is who I am. All these things happen." And what was the last plague that happened that caused the Egyptians to say, "Yep, we're done with you guys. Get out"?
The dying of the firstborn son.
Correct. So we get the meal known as
Passover.
Passover. So that's where we get the Passover meal. So the Passover meal, which is still done today by our Jewish brothers and sisters, it's very big. A friend of mine who's Jewish, they when we were at the Passover last time, he wants to invite me, but I said, well, it's a little hard because it's drilling right around Holy Week.
Yeah.
When you do that, and you don't live around me, but the preparations they go through is a lot. They go through a lot of different preparations for this, and this is a very big celebration and he's not overtly religious, but in general, this is something huge within the Jewish psyche.
My son-in-law too. He's not Jewish anymore, but
Yep.
they still do the Passover.
Yeah, I mean, this is
You would do it here
yeah,
if you want to.
yeah. I might take you up on that because I think it'd be interesting. But so they have this. So everybody sort of know what the Passover meal is like. Have you ever experienced a Seder meal before, a Passover meal?
We had one
When
here.
Louise's
Yeah, we did
son-in-law
have
came
this.
once.
But it wasn't
So-
everything.
So why don't you explain it to me again. So just talk to me about what are some of the things that you remember from that meal. So it's normally lamb, right?
What?
You normally have lamb.
Now Janice cooks brisket
Okay.
because lamb is harder to keep hot and warm, and
Yeah.
people don't like lamb as well as brisket.
There you
So-
go.
So that's what they have. And I can't remember everything else.
The bitter herbs.
The bitter herbs
Yeah.
and the egg.
Yeah.
I don't remember why they have the egg and the vinegar and
And so like I said, the interesting thing about the Passover is they sort of reenact these stories that we're learning about.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. So like even one part, like we're going to talk about the Red Sea today, is they take their wine and they drop 12 drops of wine on their plate to symbolize the death of the Egyptians and how they felt. They didn't, to think of them during that time. So I think that's an interesting part of that as well too.
and the dishes they use, they wash up and put away until next year.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a very big thing in the Jewish culture.
The children are asked all kinds of questions
Yeah,
to get them involved with it.
Yeah.
absolutely. So, in Passover is the meal that Jesus was celebrating the night he was betrayed, as we say for the communion liturgy. So, the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread and broke it and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body given for you." This was all during Passover. So this is why the book of Exodus is one of those huge books to read and to sort of say, okay, so you can see a lot of the symbolism that comes through later on in the other Gospels and stuff. So the Egyptians kicked the Jewish folks out. Get out. Well, like most people, oh, why did we do that? They were doing all our labor for us. Well, let's get them back. So the whole Egyptian army rides out after the Jewish folks. And God, at this time, they'd been gone for a little while. Couple days, like a week or so. But they have men, women, and children. They're walking. There's a lot of people. They don't walk very fast. And God is sort of in front of them as a fire in the evening and as a cloud by day. So they sort of walk with him. And they get to the point where the Egyptians have caught up with them. And that's where we start our lesson today. So the Egyptians are here. And God has actually, the part we don't get to read today is God actually swings around and back and sort of holds the Egyptians at bay for right now. And now they're at the Red Sea. So they're between a rock and a hard place. The Egyptians are behind them. God is holding them off for right now. But they don't have anywhere to go. And so this is where we pick up for the story for today. So we are in Exodus chapter 14. Verses 5 through 7, then 10 to 14, then 21 to 29. So who would like to read really briefly Exodus 14, 5 through 7?
When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made his chariot ready and took his people with him, or his army. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them.
Can you imagine 600 chariots?
That's a lot of chariots. Yeah, see, meant business. This wasn't a small thing. So who would like to read 10 to 14?
As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord. The Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still."
And then 21 to 29.
Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the hosts of Pharaoh, that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left.
Awesome. So one part that we didn't read was 15, and I just want to say this one because it says, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. So there's a funny piece to this in that Moses was beseeching God, and God's like, shut up and go. So we don't hear it in the English like that, but that's basically, if you read the Hebrew, it's sort of like God's like, Moses, zip it, move it. So I thought that was pretty good. So this is so thoughts about this story. What do you think? What does this story sort of bring out to you, or out of the whole sort of Exodus in general? What does that mean for you?
Well, it's part of the blessing
Mhm.
back of Genesis. It's moving on to their own country,
Absolutely.
away from the
Yeah.
Egyptians.
And we can even see that the Israelites were a blessing for the Egyptians, doing all their
Yeah.
work for them. They were blessed to be a blessing. And so that's
When they're
something.
gone there.
Yeah,
What do we do?
exactly. What do we do?
Who's going to do it now?
Absolutely. They're thinking like that.
And it's really an imagery of stepping out in faith, because I can't imagine, the visual is so incredible to see, to just picture these walls of this
Water.
body of water that are separated, and who's going to be the first one to step out there? It's going to just anytime. I mean, that was really quite some faith. That
Courage.
courage.
Yeah.
Took courage.
How many people was it?
It's a lot of people.
Lot.
A lot of people.
Loads of
Thousands.
6 chariots.
Yeah.
60.
600 chariots.
How many?
So for the
600
Israelites,
chariots.
I
How
want
many
to
Israelites?
say a couple thousand. Probably
I think
10,000.
I think more than that.
Yeah.
I've heard 2 to 3 million.
Just because the
Million.
women didn't get
Right.
counted when they
Correct.
kind of talked
Yeah.
about the
And the
verses of
children.
how
Yeah.
many thousand.
Yeah.
That
So
was the men.
and so it took them a long time to get them across. Just to know there's a lot. I think that's the big thing. They might give you numbers, but a lot of times what the author is trying to get across to is there's a ton of people. So it's not like 5 people running across. It's like, just think of the whole city of Baldwin.
It would have taken time.
Yes, it would take time, because you have people that can't walk very well. It's not just the men; it's women and children. Kids are probably like, "Wow, that looks great." No, we got to go. But what about? Oh, I see a fish. No, we got to go.
Finger in there.
Exactly. You're like, come on, let's go. So, it's.
Do you think if we hadn't had the movies that we've had to see, what would your visual be? Would the same or maybe better? Or, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that Charlton Heston
Yeah.
one. I always
Yeah.
remember that. So, yeah, that's.
One of the visuals, one of the things they walked across on dry ground.
Mhm.
You take water away, there's mud,
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
a long time.
Right.
but they walked across on dry
They didn't
ground.
sink.
But then the Egyptians come in, and now their chariot wheels get stuck. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
supernatural.
Yeah,
Right.
yep.
To go from dry ground to back to mud or sand,
Absolutely.
short time.
And I think the other thing too, that as you think about this, Exodus has been used by a wide variety of folks for a lot of different reasons, but a lot of, I should say, there's a lot of folks that use this text, and it's for very similar reasons, because it talks about how do we get out of our bondage. And you can look at that bondage from very many different ways. We can see that from like Harriet Tubman back during the Civil War. She was often referred to as Moses as well too, as she helped people along the Underground Railroad go back north from the south. This text, or these type of scenes, are helpful for people who are battling addiction. So you see that God frees you from what is sort of keeping you captive. And so that's sort of the language that this text really speaks to us about. It speaks about to how do you need to be freed? You know, what can God do to free you from whatever situation it is? I mean, there's, like I said, you have the wide gambit. You have addiction, you have slavery, and the thing about slavery right now is it was interesting to say there's actually more slaves nowadays than there was back during the American Civil War. And they talk about like sexual slaves, you know. So that's the one thing that I know. I had somebody come up to me and say, you know, can we put those in our bathroom? So in each of the bathrooms, there's a sign that says if you are, you know, a victim of sexual slavery, you know, here's the contact number for the state of Wisconsin. But I thought that was really sad to hear that where we've come with that. So with sex trafficking and stuff like that. So
It's very true, though.
it is.
Very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
Listen to Dr. Phil every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So but like I said, I think the story really does a good job of talking about how God helps free us, and that sort of the character and nature of God is a God who wants us to be free. And God walks alongside of us, even in the midst of our being chained to whatever it is that chains us. So what do you think about that? So what, have you had an instance like that? I know with Cross, they're doing a bunch of ministries for people who are suffering from addiction and stuff like that, and that's one thing they've been helping people with. But yeah, it's been. I think that's probably the one thing I've noticed as a pastor over the last couple of years is the rise in people who have a lot more addictions than I previously knew about or stuff like that. I mean, it's, you know, in my personal life, you know, just here in Baldwin, you know, that type of stuff. Even colleagues as well too. I mean, it's, you know, I don't think we as people understand how pervasive and prevalent addictions are. I mean, there's a lot of addictions out there, and it's not just like drug and alcohol. It could be shopping, it could be eating. I mean, there's a wide range of different things that people are addicted to. And so, but this text today reminds us that in the face of those things, that God can and God does free us if we listen. Right? I mean, that's the hard part. You know, the hard part is being able to say, yes, I need help, and asking God for help. So
I've had a couple of instances in my life where I kind of felt like the Israelites talking to Moses there, that, well, why did you let me get into this situation? Wouldn't it be better if I was just back where the previous situation? But
You talked about that about a week ago as one of your sermons.
Yeah.
Is why does God let us get into bad predicaments?
Why do
Same thing.
bad things happen to good people?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I think it's interesting too, you know, when you're talking about that too, Don, is how we are really good at saying, look what you made me do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think this text reminds us that we need to be responsible for what our actions are. As much as somebody else makes you mad, you have a choice to how you respond. You always have a choice, even when you don't think so. I like to remind people of that. Well, you made me. I said, I didn't make you do anything. You're freely choosing to act this way. Yes, you might not agree with me. Yes, I might have said some stuff you didn't want to hear. But at the end of the day, you are choosing how you react. And I think that's something I think a lot of people in our society need to sort of glam on to. Because how many people do you know well, the government made me do that, or, this here, that, or, this person made me, and I'm like, no. You get that choice. You have that power. You have the power to say, this is how I'm going to react to this situation. No, I don't like that. Or, I'm not going to deal with that. That's fine. But own up to the choice. Don't tell me somebody else is making your choices for you, because they are not.
And whether those choices are good or bad,
Yeah.
if we trust God, He can make something
Help
good
you out
come
a
of
little
it.
Exactly.
It was Troy's fault that he roasted a turkey last night and invited me for supper. Dressing and gravy, and
You didn't bring any
Turkey.
leftovers, though.
I have them on my refrigerator.
So as you think about this text for this week, how does that change your sort of perspective? Because have you ever said that to somebody? Well, you made me do that. You made me think that way. You made me. So what does it mean for you today to learn that you have power over your own decisions? No one's going to make you do anything. You have a choice. I think that's one of the most powerful things about Christianity, is to realize you have a choice. You don't have to accept the status quo. I think we've been talking about that too, right? How long ago did I just talk about? You don't have to deal with, we have new beginnings all the time. And this is a reminder. This is why we have new beginnings, because you have a God that walks with you. In the midst of all the hard of the world, all the difficulties of the world, all the bad stuff in the world. So how, again, will this change you for this week? What is one thing that you're going to respond the way that you need to respond, as opposed to someone else making you respond that way? What's one thing you can respond differently this week? The way that you need to respond. Not how they want you to respond, but how do you want to respond? What do you think?
We have a choice.
We do.
That's exactly what I learned today out of this.
Yeah, you
We have
have.
a choice. You're exactly right.
Yeah, because like I said, the way that you respond is totally up to you. This is why it's always interesting when something bad happens, or something good even. It's always interesting to see how people respond, because the same event will happen to the same person, and they'll have a totally different response to somebody else, right? Somebody's car tire goes flat, and it's the worst thing ever, and it's God's against me, and everything's going to be horrible. And the other person's like, well, yeah, I just called somebody to fix it, and good thing I have AAA, and we're all good. I had to wait a little bit, but we had a conversation with such and such, and it was just fine. It's the same event, though. Both of them still had the flat tire. Both of them still were inconvenienced. But their approach is different. And it's not to say that the approach is easy. Like I said, because you're going to run into stuff that's going to really be hard to deal with, right? You know your buttons that get pushed, right? We all have our buttons, right? We all have our buttons that get pushed, whether our spouses do them, or our friends, or our family. We get our buttons pushed. But so it's in the midst of that we have to figure out, well, how am I going to respond to that? Is it engaging with somebody, or maybe it's disengaging with them for a little while? Hey, I've had to work with you enough today. I'm not going to drive myself crazy by doing that. I'm going to take a little bit of time and, do what I need to do, so that way I can come back fresh and be able to talk to you in a good manner. So that's what I want you really to work on this week, because I need to work on that too. So any other thoughts about this particular text?
Earlier we were talking about Pharaoh and what he kind of thought of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't read it, it wasn't part of the text, but verse 3, where God is talking to Moses, he says, "For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, They are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. My footnote for that, because the area south and east of Egypt was a wilderness, Pharaoh would conclude that Israel missed the main road to Canaan and lost their way. Doesn't say much for his opinion of Moses and the Israelites.
No. And like I said, everybody, and the other thing, keep reminding yourself as we read about these biblical characters, they are flawed people. Moses was not perfect by any stretch.
Human beings.
Yeah, they're human beings. The people that we read about in these stories are not some perfect people. They all have their flaws. I think that's one of the...
Just like us in other
Yeah,
words.
absolutely. And I think that's the most interesting thing about the Bible is the characters we read about are people that we can, if this was a fairy tale, they really did a good job with it. I'll tell you that because, they don't, if you look at a lot of other myths or legends or stuff like that, these people are like larger than life. People we're reading about are people that could be your neighbor. And I think that's the big thing about Christianity and faith like that is the people that you're reading about, the people that we see the situations they're in, we could really relate to that. I mean, it's not some mystical gobbledygook that doesn't make any sense, but it's stuff that we can say and go, yeah, I have a neighbor, who has, this problem, or, my brother and sister are dealing with this, or, when I think of, like an addiction or something like that, I think of my friend that, such and such, it's, and this is why this stuff is important. Is as much as it is reading the text, it's realizing what's underneath the text. That we serve a God that does not want us to be locked down, that doesn't want us to be enslaved, but a God who asks us, what does freedom look like? And probably even the harder question, how do you live into freedom? Do you feel like that right now? Do you feel like you live into freedom every day? Do you feel free? Or do you feel weighed down?
We have a choice to be free.
You do. You have a choice.
Yeah. I choose to be free.
Yeah. So another thing to think about. Will you choose to live freely today? And if you do, what does that look like? How is that different than how you're living right now? And what will your kids think about that?
I'd like to know where I am. It's where were you?
I know if I keep my mouth shut, that helps me a lot.
That's how you'll respond differently. So, well, good. Anything else about this text? Anything else that you found interesting, or just our discussion, or any questions? Like I said, I'm always happy. I don't always know the answer, but I'm always happy to pontificate with you about what could be the answer. So, but yeah, I hope you've been enjoying this sort of stuff. The hard part about the narrative, it really does jump around from time to time. And so, like I said,
Skipped a lot.
It skipped a lot. No, and they talked about that on the commentary. The people who wrote the narrative, I listened to why they do certain stuff, and they said, well, they always take a story out of Exodus. In this particular year, this is the story they were picking versus something closer, But they said this was it reminds us again, what does it mean to be free? And how do you live into that freedom? And will you let yourself live into that freedom? That's the other thing. Will you let yourself be free? Or do you think, no, can't do that? Because it's going to be a new beginning when you live free. So, all right, so where are we at next week?
Exodus 19.
Exodus 19.
Covenant and commandments.
Covenant and commandments. Okay, so that'll be a good one for us to look at. So.
Nathan calls me every Wednesday night to see what we studied.
Oh, Nathan does.
Yeah.
Good. All right, so before we get the prayers, I have to turn this thing off.
Well, he can get it on
Yeah,
podcast.
you can listen to the podcast now. So thank you all for joining us for our podcast. We will see you next week. And again, we're Exodus 19.
Yes.
Exodus 19 for next week. I hope you have a great week. And as always, as we pray, I invite you to take some time after the Bible study to pray for yourself and for the people around you. And remember, the other question I have is, how will you live free this week? And what does that look like? And if you can, leave a comment down in the video or tell one of the people at the Bible study or me as well too.